Everyone wants to know what happens after death. Religions, movies, books, those late-night conversations when sleep just won't come. But how many times have you asked yourself the opposite question? Where were you before you were born? And I'm not talking about your parents' story, how they met, the cell that divided. The question is different. You, this thing that's listening to these words right now and knows it exists, where was that before your body showed up in the world? There was a time when you had no name. You weren't afraid of anything. You didn't miss anyone. You didn't carry a single regret. The strangest part is that you don't remember that time as something bad. You don't remember darkness. You don't remember loneliness. You don't remember absolutely anything, because there was nobody there to remember. And then a paradox comes up that really gets under your skin when you decide to face it head on. If before being born there was no pain, no anguish, no suffering of any kind, why does the idea of ceasing to exist scare us so much? The artificial intelligence axiom processed thousands of studies in neuroscience, philosophy, records on fetal consciousness, and contemplative traditions from different centuries and continents. It cross-referenced laboratory data, with reflections accumulated over millennia, all to investigate this question that seems simple, but that no civilization has managed to answer. The result is unsettling, because the deeper you go, the more the ground disappears from under your feet. Before getting into philosophy or speculation about the soul, it's worth starting with what you can actually measure in a lab, record on equipment, document in a study reviewed by other scientists. Because sometimes what science discovers leaves you more shaken than any myth. Neuroscience already knows when life begins. Cells multiply, organs take shape, biology handles that. What keeps researchers up at night is something else entirely. When someone shows up in there. When that tissue being formed stops being just a process and starts to harbor something that feels, that experiences, that will one day be able to say, I exist. For a long time, the most accepted answer was that consciousness emerged at birth. The first cry would be the first instant of experience. Before that, just a body under construction with nobody inside. Modern neuroscience complicated that idea in a way we're still trying to process. For consciousness to exist, you need a brain. Seems obvious, but the consequences are enormous. Without neurons connecting, firing signals, forming networks, the sensation of being someone doesn't exist. And the brain doesn't show up ready-made. It assembles itself bit by bit, layer upon layer over 9 months. The first neurons appear around the 5th week, scattered, disconnected, incapable of producing anything resembling thought. It's like having bricks scattered across a building site. The material is there, but there's no house whatsoever. The first synapses show up around the 8th week, but they're still primitive, reflexive, with no capacity to handle complex information. The thalamus, a structure that works as a sensory distribution hub in the brain, starts connecting with the cortex around the 24th week. This is the point where neuroscientists really pay attention, because without this bridge, the brain can't integrate information and produce conscious experience. The thalamus receives signals from the senses and routes them to the cortex for processing. Without this connection, the signals don't arrive anywhere. Before the 24th week, the chance of conscious experience existing is extremely low. Science doesn't say impossible, science never uses that word, but it says unlikely based on everything we know about how the brain works. After that mark, something changes. The connections establish themselves, brain waves show new patterns, and the fetus starts reacting to stimuli in ways that go beyond reflexes. In 2013, researchers used electroencephalography to measure fetal brain activity at different stages. Before the 24th week, fragmented activity, no pattern. After that, coordinated waves, like an orchestra finally rehearsing together for the first time after months, with each musician playing alone in their own corner. There's another piece of data that's hard to sit with. Premature babies born around the 25th week survive outside the womb. And these babies respond to pain. They cry, curl up, turn their faces away from unpleasant stimuli, show a preference for their mother's voice. Are these purely reflexive responses? Or is there something more in there, a beginning of experience, a first glimmer of what will one day become full consciousness? We don't know. We can measure brain activity, observe behaviors, but we can't get inside the experience of a fetus and ask what it feels. There's no way to know if there's someone in there, or if everything we observe is just the automatic responses of a nervous system that hasn't yet produced an observer. This is the hard problem of consciousness, a term coined by the philosopher David Chalmers, applied to the most fundamental moment there is. This problem pushes us into territory where science alone can't cut it anymore. If we want to know when consciousness begins, we first need to figure out what it is. And here the ground gets swampy. Consciousness is your experience right now, listening to these words, knowing you're here. It's the only thing you can be absolutely certain of. And yet nobody can explain how it arises. We know it has to do with the brain. When the brain takes a hit, consciousness changes. Certain substances alter it, certain damage destroys it. 3 pounds of grey matter somehow produces the experience of seeing the colour red, of feeling longing, of recognizing a song you hadn't heard since childhood. Axiom cross-referenced decades of research in cognitive neuroscience with philosophical debates about the nature of mind. And what emerges is a realization that makes you uncomfortable. We can map which areas of the brain light up when you see a face. We can even predict choices before you make them. But the distance between understanding the mechanism and understanding the experience has barely shrunk in 50 years. Explaining how the brain works, that's come a long way. What nobody can explain is why that functioning generates someone in there, feeling everything. If consciousness is gradual, as some scientists argue, the fetus wouldn't go from unconscious to conscious all at once. It would be more like dawn, first darkness, then a faint glow, then more light, until at some point there's daylight. Other researchers disagree strongly, arguing that without certain neural structures in place, no experience happens. Not weak experience, not blurry experience. For these researchers before that point, there's simply nothing. Even accepting that some consciousness exists after the 24th week, it wouldn't be anything like ours. The fetus floats in amniotic fluid, stable temperature, almost no light, muffled sounds, nutrients arriving directly through the cord. Researchers suggest it spends most of the time in a state comparable to deep sleep. Without language, there are no thoughts as we know them. With nothing to differentiate from nothing, there are no memories. What's left is maybe some scattered sensations, if they even exist. This leads to the heart of the question. When we ask where we were before being born, we're assuming there was an us somewhere. But it could be that this assumption is already the mistake. It could be that there was no us waiting to enter a body. This us might have assembled itself bit by bit, piece by piece, until something emerged that could say, I. Developmental neuroscience reveals something strange about identity. The self you feel you are right now wasn't there from the beginning. It was built. The memories that define who you are formed after birth. The personality you call your own was shaped in the first years of life. Even the sensation of having a body, that this body is yours, is something the brain learns to generate. Newborns don't know where they end and the world begins. Who were you before all of that was assembled? The most honest answer science has is probably nobody. There's a thought experiment that helps you see the size of the whole. If it were possible to create an exact copy of your brain, atom by atom, neuron by neuron, that copy would have your memories, your personality, would feel like it was you. From its perspective, it would be you. But you'd still be existing on the other side of the room. What makes you you and not an identical copy? Science has no answer, and that gap suggests there's something about consciousness and identity that escapes current methods. Not necessarily something supernatural, maybe just something we haven't learned to investigate yet. There are researchers who've studied children between 2 and 5 years old who say they remember from before they were born. They describe sensations of floating in the dark, of being wrapped in something warm, of hearing their mother's voice muffled. Some say they chose their parents, that they watched the family from somewhere before arriving. Science treats these accounts as false memories, constructions of a child's mind trying to make sense of its own existence. Young children don't separate well what they invent from what they remember. This proves little about prenatal consciousness, but it proves a lot about how the human mind tells stories to itself. But these accounts show something worth paying attention to. We're not content with simply beginning. We need to have come from somewhere. The idea that we sprouted from nothing, that before a certain point there was nobody and then there was, is almost unbearable. This might be the real reason the question won't let us go. It goes beyond curiosity. It has to do with the desire to know we're something more than a biological accident, that this existence has roots in something bigger than a meeting of cells. Science can point to when the connections took hold, describe how a cluster of cells became something capable of asking about its own origin. What it can't do is close the distance between matter and consciousness. When science hits that wall, the ones who'd been waiting on the other side for millennia were the philosophers. Long before hospitals and laboratories existed, human beings were already racking their brains over this very question, and they weren't doing it for fun. They were doing it because they needed an answer in order to go on living. The idea of having emerged from nothing, of not having existed for billions of years, and suddenly being here, breathing, feeling fear, created a vertigo that needed to become something. It needed to become meaning. Axiom traced how different philosophical traditions, separated by centuries and continents, tried to answer this question and found something curious. The answers are different, sometimes opposite, but they all spring from the same place. From that moment when a human being looks up at the night sky and wonders what they were doing there before there was anyone to look. Plato, almost 2,500 years ago, gave an answer that to this day many people feel is true, without knowing they're echoing him. When someone says, "I have the feeling I already knew this person," or "I feel like I've lived this before," they're brushing up against something Plato tried to put into words in ancient Greece. For him, the soul existed before the body. It was eternal, and it had lived in a place he called the world of forms, a realm of pure ideas where knowledge was direct, without the limitations of the senses. Being born wasn't a beginning, it was a fall. The moment when the soul left that place and fell into the prison of the body, forgetting almost everything it knew. This would explain why sometimes we recognize truths nobody taught us, why certain mathematical concepts seem obvious once you understand them, why certain songs move us for no apparent reason. Plato gave this a Greek name, anamnesis, which means something like unforgetting. Learning wasn't gaining new knowledge, it was remembering what the soul already knew. In the Meno, Socrates takes an uneducated man, and just by asking questions leads him to demonstrate a geometry theorem. The man didn't learn anything, Socrates argued, he merely remembered. If the knowledge was already in there, it had to have been acquired at some point. For Plato, that moment was before birth. The idea is beautiful, you have to admit. It solves the problem of origin in an elegant way. You didn't sprout from nothing, you always existed. Birth was a transition, not an absolute beginning. And death would be another transition, the soul returning free, recovering what it had lost. A story with symmetry, with justice. The kind that makes death seem less frightening. Except, Plato had no way to prove any of it. Where is this world of forms? How does a soul without a body interact with matter? If it existed before, why do we only remember in fragments, never with clarity? Aristotle, who was Plato's student for 20 years, disagreed at the root. For him, the soul wasn't a separate thing living inside the body. It was the form of the body, the way it was organized. You couldn't separate the soul from the body any more than you can separate the shape of a statue from the marble it's made of. Break the statue and the shape vanishes with it. Destroy the body and the soul ends too. There's no before, there's no after, there's only this right here. This view is closer to what science says today, though Aristotle arrived at it by entirely different paths. But it's also more frightening, because if the soul is what the body does, before your body existed, there was nothing of yours anywhere. You're a temporary phenomenon, a parenthesis between two infinities of non-existence. The following centuries saw these two views collide. Christianity adopted a version of Plato, a soul created by God at conception, immortal. Islam developed the concept of ruh, the spirit breathed into the fetus. Judaism brought more varied views, and Kabbalah elaborated theories about reincarnation. They all shared the same conviction and believed there was something beyond the body, something that promised continuity. The before birth could be mysterious, but it wasn't nothingness. There was origin, there was a plan. Then along came René Descartes in the 17th century and decided to start from scratch. He doubted everything: the senses that could deceive, the world that could be a dream, his own body that might not exist. But there was one thing he couldn't doubt: the fact that he was doubting. Someone in there was thinking. I think, therefore I am. The only absolute certainty was the existence of consciousness. Descartes split the universe into two substances, mind and matter, and proposed they interacted in the pineal gland, the only brain structure that isn't duplicated. Today we know the pineal gland just regulates sleep rhythms. But what Descartes did, and this changed everything after him, was place consciousness at the center of philosophy. Before him, the questions revolved around God and the cosmos. After him, the question became something else. What is this thing that thinks? Where does it come from? Did it exist before the body? And what Descartes opened up, the philosophers who followed tried to resolve in increasingly radical ways. After Descartes, each philosopher pulled in a different direction. Spinoza argued that mind and matter were two ways of looking at a single infinite substance, and your individual consciousness would be a wave in that ocean, never separate from it. Leibniz went down a different path and proposed that the universe was made of indivisible units of experience, eternal, so you always existed in some form. The most radical was Berkeley, who said matter didn't even exist. All there was were perceptions in minds, and the world stayed standing because God never stopped looking. Each view gave a different answer to the before-birth question. For Spinoza, before and after were illusions. Leibniz said you always existed in some form. Berkeley dismissed the entire question, thought it didn't even make sense. But it was Immanuel Kant, at the end of the 18th century, who changed the rules of the game, and we still feel it today. Kant argued that human reason has limits. We know the world as it appears to us, but we can't access the world as it is in itself. The mind structures experience through space, time, causality, and you can't take those glasses off. They're stuck to your face. Asking what there was before time is like asking what's north of the North Pole. Axiom identified in this Kantian turn one of the most decisive points in the history of thought about consciousness, because if Kant is right, asking where you were before being born might be a question with no possible answer. Not because it's hard, but because the structure is incoherent. The you only exists within time. Asking where it was outside of time is like asking what color the number 7 is. Hegel tried to surpass Kant by building a system where consciousness was the engine of history, the entire universe unfolding to know itself. Schopenhauer went to the opposite side. Darker, reality would be a blind will, purposeless, and individual consciousness just a temporary bubble on the surface of a dark ocean. The most radical break came in the 20th century. For Sartre, the question had been wrongly framed from the start. There was no you waiting to be thrown into existence. Existence comes first. Then, through choices and actions, you gradually become something. There's no predefined essence, no soul waiting in line. We are condemned to be free, he wrote. Nobody chose to be born. We were thrown in here without asking, but once inside, there's no escaping the responsibility of choosing who we are. Heidegger, who walked close to the existentialists but rejected the label, created a concept that in English translates roughly to thrownness. One day we find ourselves existing, without having asked, without having chosen the era, the family, the body. By the time we start asking who we already are someone. We always arrive late to our own existence. This view doesn't offer comfort, but it offers something perhaps more honest. The recognition that we're here without knowing why, and that it's from this condition that we need to live. While the West walked this path, the East had been exploring different directions for millennia. In Hinduism, samsara describes a cycle of births and deaths. The Atman, which is the individual self, would actually be identical to Brahman, what they call the ultimate reality of the universe. That is you. But this identity is forgotten, covered by Maya, the illusion of separation. The spiritual life would be the path to remembering who you really are, and when you manage it, you reach moksha, liberation. Where were you before you were born? in another life, and before that one, in another. The cycle has no known beginning. A drop that has passed through 1,000 rivers and believes this river is the only one that exists. Buddhism was more radical. Buddha denied the existence of a permanent Atman. There is no fixed self traveling from life to life, just a flow of processes reorganizing without end. What you call I is a convenient name for this flow. When someone dies, the processes give way to new processes. Like a candle lighting another, the flame isn't the same, but there's continuity of cause. Rebirth without anyone reincarnating. If the self is an illusion, asking where it was before birth is looking for the origin of a mirage. There's a Zen story that ties this up in a way you can't shake. A student asks the master what his original face was before his parents were born. The master doesn't answer, just smiles. The question has no answer in the usual sense. The face you're looking for is the one looking right now. This kind of question, called a koan in Zen, exists to break through thought and provoke something words can't reach. And after millennia of philosophy, what's left? Not an answer, but a map of possibilities. And maybe the most honest thing you can say is that this question doesn't exist to be answered. It exists to change the way you look at your own existence. Let's be real. After all of this, we're still right where we started. We don't know where we were before being born. We probably never will. And there's something in that admission that's hard to swallow. We live in an age used to having answers. Any question, you punch it into your phone and in seconds you have explanations. We've mapped the human genome, photographed black holes, sent robots to Mars. It seems like there's no limit to what we discover. And then along comes a question as simple as, where was I before I existed? And nobody has a clue. This produces vertigo. And the first reaction is to cling to some belief, any belief, that plugs the hole and lets you keep living without staring straight into the unknown. But there's another possibility. Not knowing can have value. Uncertainty doesn't have to be a problem to solve. There are questions that weren't made to have answers. They were made to be inhabited. And the way you relate to what you don't know says more about you than all the answers you carry. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote in a letter to a young writer something that sticks with you. Have patience with everything unresolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves. Don't search for the answers now because you wouldn't be able to live them. Live the questions. Perhaps someday, without noticing, you'll end up living the answer. What a strange idea for a generation trained to solve everything fast. A question without an answer feels like a failure, but Rilke proposes that certain questions are valuable precisely because they don't close, and letting them work inside you transforms more than any hasty conclusion. In the data Axiom gathered, cross-referencing contemplative traditions with psychology research, a pattern appeared that repeats across millennia. People who can coexist with open questions, without needing definitive answers for everything, report higher levels of well-being and less existential anxiety than those who need certainty to function. Dwelling in the mystery, by all indications, works like a skill you can train. When you truly ask yourself the question of where you were before being born, when you let it drop from your head into your body, something starts to move. You notice how strange it is to exist, how unlikely it is that you, specifically you, with this name, this history, this particular way of seeing things are here. Of all the possible combinations of atoms in the universe, this specific combination organized itself to produce the experience of being you. Before that, nobody experienced anything. The universe existed. The stars shone, the planets spun, but there was no you to see any of it. Billions of years of cosmic history without you. Galaxies forming, stars being born and dying, and at no point did someone with your face exist asking what any of it meant. Then, in an instant almost insignificant on the scale of the cosmos, you appeared. The atoms in your body were forged inside stars that exploded billions of years ago. The iron in your blood, the calcium in your bones, the oxygen you're breathing right now, all of it was created in stellar furnaces and scattered across the cosmos when those stars died. You are, and this is not a figure of speech, stardust that learned to ask where it came from. The astrophysicist Carl Sagan put it in a way that gives you chills when you hear it. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself, For most of its history, the universe existed with nobody to observe it. It was vast, complex, full of things happening, but nobody was there. Then, on a small planet, orbiting an ordinary star, in a galaxy among billions, something appeared that could ask questions. The universe developed the capacity to contemplate itself. That's you. And this angle shifts the question of the before birth in a subtle way that carries weight. Maybe the right question isn't where you were before. Maybe it's why there's a you now. Not in the sense of which causes produced your existence. Biology explains that, at least in part. But in the deeper sense, why does something exist that can ask itself this question? Why isn't the universe simply matter and energy interacting in the dark without anyone knowing about any of it? Why does experience exist? Why does consciousness exist? Nobody knows. And maybe that not knowing is exactly the point. There's an easy trap when we think about these things, believing that the meaning of life has to come from outside life, that we need an answer about where we came from for existing to be worth anything, that if there was no prior purpose, no plan, no design, then everything is absurd. But it's the opposite. The meaning isn't in the before, it's in the now. You don't need to know where you came from for what you live to carry weight. The weight is in the fact that you're here, feeling, thinking, loving, suffering. These experiences don't need justification from the outside. They're worth it on their own. Albert Camus wrote about this in a way that takes a while to land, but once it does, it never leaves. For Camus, the universe doesn't answer. It doesn't say why we're here, doesn't explain where we came from, doesn't offer an instruction manual. And this confrontation between the human desire to find meaning and the silence of the cosmos, this is what he called the absurd. But absurd for Camus didn't mean life is worthless. It meant we're the ones who make the meaning. We don't find it ready-made, we don't receive it as a gift. We build it with our hands, with our choices, with the bonds we forge. He used the myth of Sisyphus to show this. Sisyphus condemned to push a boulder to the top of a mountain, only to watch it roll back down, every day, forever. Seems like the height of meaninglessness. But Camus ends the essay with a sentence that sounds like madness until you stop and think about it slowly. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. How can someone be happy pushing a boulder uphill forever? Because happiness doesn't depend on reaching the top. It depends on how you relate to the effort, to the journey, to the fact of being alive, even without being sure of anything. This idea shows up in so many different places, from philosophical sources to records of existential therapy, that when Axiom mapped it all, the pattern was hard to ignore. Accepting the absurd, far from leading to paralysis, tends to work as a turning point. People who stop demanding definitive answers from life and start engaging with the process of living show, in the studies, more resilience and a greater capacity to find purpose in everyday life. Think of a small child. A child doesn't ask where it came from or worry about what will happen when it's over. It's simply here, fully present in each moment. It marvels at things we've stopped seeing. An ant carrying a crumb, a cloud that looks like an animal, the sound of rain on the window. I'm not saying we should ignore the hard questions, they matter, but we can learn from children something about how to deal with what has no explanation. Not with fear, with curiosity. Now there's something that connects the before birth with the after death, and when you see this connection, the whole picture changes. They're two sides of the same coin. The before birth we don't remember as something bad. There was no suffering there, no fear. Because there was nobody to feel anything, it was an absence of experience. So why does the after death scare us so much? If it's similar to the before, if it's another absence, why does one terrify and the other doesn't? The most direct answer is that now there's something to lose. Before being born there was no consciousness, no identity, no memories, no people we love. You couldn't miss anything because nothing existed to miss. But now it does. Now there's a life. There are people, projects, dreams, mornings we want to see arrive, and the idea that all of this disappears is hard to accept. Epicurus tried to face this fear over 2,000 years ago with a simple argument. Death is nothing to us. When we exist, it isn't present. When it's present, we no longer exist, we never meet. It's logical, it makes sense in your head, but it doesn't capture everything, because we make plans, we anticipate, we imagine what comes next. Nobody is actually afraid of being dead if you stop to think about it. What squeezes the chest is the idea of stopping living, the anticipatory grief for everything that won't happen. But here comes a twist. This very fact that one day all of this ends is exactly what gives weight to each moment. If we were immortal, if we had infinite time, nothing would have urgency. You could always leave it for later, but we don't have infinite time. This moment right now won't repeat. When it's gone forever. And that, instead of being depressing, is what gives life its intensity. It's what makes love worth it, makes beauty move us, makes each day a chance that won't come back. Rumi, the Sufi poet of the 13th century, left a phrase that fits here. You are not a drop in the ocean, you are the entire ocean in a drop. The most common reading is mystical. It speaks of the union of the soul with the divine. But there's another way to understand it that might fit better with what we're talking about. You're not a separate drop from the cosmos that appeared from nothing and will vanish into nothing. You are the cosmos itself, temporarily organized into a form that produces experience. Before you were born, the atoms that now make up your body were scattered across the universe. After you die, they'll scatter again. But the cosmos keeps being the cosmos. Only the configuration changes. The matter that was you will become other things, earth, tree, air, maybe one day part of another being that can look up at the sky and wonder where it came from. This perspective doesn't resolve the fear of death. It doesn't. It doesn't make losing someone you love hurt any less. The pain is real, the loss is real, there's no cosmic angle that erases that. But there's something calming in knowing that we didn't come from absolute nothingness and won't go to absolute nothingness. We came from the cosmos and we return to the cosmos. This interval of consciousness, this parenthesis where matter manages to contemplate itself, is a gift the universe gives to itself. For a moment, someone is looking, and that moment is now. The question of where you were before being born might seem like the stuff of sleepless nights, philosophical curiosity with no practical consequence, something to think about when sleep won't come. But that doesn't change breakfast the next morning. Except it does. How you position yourself before this question affects how you live. If you believe the soul is eternal, that it existed before and will exist after, that reorganizes your priorities. This life becomes a stage of something larger. Your actions gain consequences that go beyond what the eyes can see. If you believe there was nobody before you were born, and there will be nobody after you die, priorities shift in a different way. This life becomes the only one there is. There's no second chance, no reward in a place nobody has visited and come back to tell about. What you do here, how you treat the people around you, how you spend your time, gains a different weight. It weighs because it's all you've got. If you lean toward the view that the self is an illusion, as certain Eastern traditions suggest, then the whole thing shifts even more radically. The entire question dissolves. There's no you that existed before, nor one that exists now. Just a flow of experience arising and vanishing at every instant. The fear of death loses its object. The attachment to identity loosens. There's a strange freedom in this view, though it can also be frightening. At the end of this whole investigation, after cross-referencing neuroscience with millennia of philosophy and traditions from various continents, Axiom arrived at a place that feels less like a conclusion and more like an acknowledgement. None of the answers humanity has produced to this day can be proven, and none can be definitively ruled out. We're in territory where reason reaches its limit, and what's left is a choice. A choice about how you want to relate to the mystery of your own existence. A choice that says more about who you are than about how the universe actually works. I'm not here to tell you what to believe. That choice is yours and yours alone. But it's worth making it with your eyes open, instead of leaving the question forgotten in a corner of your mind, unexamined, untouched. Because the way you answer, even provisionally, even surrounded by doubt, will color every day that comes after. There's a paradox that keeps spinning in your head, and it might be the strangest one of all. The fact that you're here right now wondering where you came from, that is already the greatest mystery. Not the mystery of the before, not the mystery of the after, but the mystery of the now. Because think about it, you could have never appeared. For nearly all of the universe's history, there was no sign of you, and for most of its future, there won't be either. This window of consciousness is incredibly brief on the cosmic scale, a blink, a breath, almost nothing. And yet here you are right now, hearing these words, feeling what you feel, thinking what you think, existing. We don't know why. We don't know how, in the deepest sense. We don't know where we truly came from beyond partial explanations that don't touch the bottom of the mystery, but we know we're here, and that is undeniable, the only absolute certainty any person carries. Right now there is experience, there is consciousness, there is a universe knowing itself through you. It may not matter where you were before being born. Perhaps what's truly astonishing is that, for an instant almost irrelevant in the history of the cosmos, there is something rather than nothing, except this something isn't eternal, isn't guaranteed, isn't safe. But it's real, and now it's us. On one of those nights when you lift your eyes to the sky, remember this. Those stars you see have been shining for billions of years. Some don't even exist anymore, but their light keeps traveling to you. And there you are, looking, knowing that you look, a point of consciousness in a universe that for the vast majority of time is conscious of nothing. An unlikely witness to a beauty that existed for eons, with nobody to see it. I don't know where we came from. I don't know where we're going. But I know this moment exists. I know you exist. And I know that alone is the greatest mystery there is. You don't need to solve it. You just need to inhabit it. If you like this investigation, subscribing to the channel helps us expand the Axiom Investigation project. We would love to read your thoughts on the video's subject in the comments and your suggestion for the next topic to be covered. Tell us which city you are watching from. Thank you for staying with us until the end.